interest of time, I'm going to skip the normal introductions. And just, if you do ask a question or speak, just introduce yourself at that time. So let me start first by welcoming everybody to the semi-monthly meeting of the Standing Panel on Social Equity and Governance. I'm Gary Glickman, the chair of the panel. Today we have a special, I would say, presentation by a panel of experts. And when Jade and I and Margaret and some others were talking about what to do at this meeting, we thought it would be very, very useful to give people an opportunity to explain the defund movement. And what is it? What does it really mean? What do we need to know about it? Because there's been a lot of press, there's been a lot of misinformation out there. It's becoming a political football. And what we really need to know is, what do we really mean when we say defund? And so we've asked a few people to come together and help us understand that issue a little bit better so that we can make our own judgments. I want to thank, first of all, Jade Barry James, who was instrumental in pulling together this panel and will be moderating, and also Margaret Sims for her input as well. So thank you both for your help. And with that, let me turn it over to Terry Garten, the president and CEO of the Academy, for a couple of remarks. Terry?
Thanks, Gary. It's wonderful to see so many people online this morning to join this really important conversation. I just want to make a couple of administrative announcements. Because of the topic and its importance, we are recording this session. We often don't record standing panels, but our participants have all given their permission for us to record this. What that means is we'll be keeping you all on centrally managed mute initially, so that we don't interrupt the flow of the conversation. And we'll be monitoring the chat. And Jade, as the moderator, will be looking for your questions in the chat when we get to that portion of the conversation. So to facilitate the recording, I would ask that you all just let the conversation flow initially. We'll keep you on mute. And then as it gets to the point of inviting question and answers, we'll do that through the moderated chat function. So if you have questions, please enter them in the chat as we go along. Jade and Margaret and Gary will pick those up in the course of the discussion. So Tithi, is there anything else we need to cover in terms of process?
No, I think you covered it.
All right. Well, with that as background, then Jade, I'll turn it over to you to begin today's discussion. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Terry. I just want to start by talking a little bit about this panel. I think that it was described as a panel whereby we agreed that we are living in an unprecedented time where meaningful dialogue really precedes action. I think that you are joining the Standing Panel on Social Equity with NAPA, whereby we've committed to an action agenda around social equity. And so today we hope that we will have a shared understanding that we can engage in a meaningful dialogue, really looking at ways in which we can eliminate racial inequality, bias, and disparities in America. I think that our discussion today is really about how money is spent. A lot of the defunding conversation, the conversation that you see in the academic journals and the news media, on the television, and in communities, more importantly, is really about prioritizing how money is spent. And so we organized today and invited this awesome panel of people, some people you know and some people you don't know, to join us to talk about this movement, what it means, and how we can really establish our action agenda. So today we have, in alphabetical order, Dr. Mohammed Al-Qadri. He's a professor and head of the Department of Public Policy at the University of Connecticut. He's a friend of friends. His current research is focused on social justice and social equity equity in public policy and administration, including gender, race, and ethnic disparities in policy and administrative outcomes. Until this year, he co-chaired the NASPA Diversity and Social Equity Committee. He has over 50 peer-reviewed articles. He's also a co-author of Women in Public Service, Barriers, Challenges, and Opportunities, as well as Things Happen, Stories from the Public Sector. His practitioner experience includes service as a senior research associate at the Center for Urban Redevelopment and Empowerment, that's at Florida Atlantic University, and as a value for money performance auditor with the Office of Auditor General of Canada in Ottawa. Dr. Al-Qadri has authored in excess of 40 community and professional studies in areas of governance and public management, and he indeed is a friend of social equity. We also have invited a fellow New Yorker. Some of you know I'm from the New Jersey community. And so Dr. Oscar Odom III currently serves as the Vice President for Security for the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation. Dr. Odom has served as a commissioner on the New York City Districting Commission of New York City. Dr. Odom is the former first deputy sheriff commissioner and 4-star chief of the New York City Sheriff's Office. He's also a retired New York City police detective, has served 20 years. He also has served several New York City mayors. Dr. Odom has had several assignments in the New York City Police Department, patrol officer, police academy instructor, intelligence division, I'm getting a little nervous here, career criminal investigation unit, and the juvenile crime squad, looking at in the fugitive enforcement division. We certainly have a distinguished guest in Dr. Odom. He has served as a news commentator on policing, criminal justice, and terrorism issues. He also has a distinguished academic career in that he's been an adjunct professor. He earned he has in fact received a JD from CUNY School of Law, where he was an associate editor of the Law Review. He also earned a doctorate of education with a specialization in educational leadership and management with distinction at Capella University. So Dr. Odom is a Fulbright Scholar criminal justice peer reviewer, and we're very happy and very lucky to have him this morning. Our last but not least guest is indeed a friend of friends, and some of you may know him. Reverend Nelson Jerome Pierce Jr. is a senior pastor of Beloved Community Church and is the Faith and Race Program Director in the Center for Faith and Justice at Xavier University. Reverend Pierce is a graduate of Eden Theological Seminary, where he earned his Master's of Divinity. He has worked in his long career to strengthen the justice ministries of churches all around the country. As a lead trainer for the Black Church Institute, Reverend Pierce led workshops and national conventions to equip pastors and churches with the tools that they need to address in a holistic way the issues of sex and sexuality. While in Ohio, Reverend Pierce has organized clergy from around the state to fight attacks on voting rights and on workers' rights, and fought to keep Ohioans safe from stand your ground legislation and police brutality. This morning, he's been very active and engaged already in sort of helping people in the community, and that's just what he does. He has, for a long time, been critical in the organizing clergy and young people in the aftermath of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. He's also recognized as a leader in that fight, with a tribute at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. So he also has led efforts to organize the voting power of the Black church, an effort that engaged over 3,000 people. And so we're very lucky, very happy, very excited to have Pastor Pierce with us today. So I'm going to get started, if that's okay. In terms of really just talking to our panel our panelists, our invited speakers. We've asked them to sort of share with us today some ideas around a couple big, broad areas. I see that my internet connection is unstable, so I'll repeat these areas. We are looking to have a conversation about defunding, what that really means, the allocation of resources, how evidence-based decision-making plays into this conversation that we're having, and really thinking about meaningful policy change to support our action agenda. So I'll get started if everyone is okay with getting started on the panel. I'll just ask this first question about defunding. So there is a lot of talk about defunding the police, what it means. And so I wonder, could you share some comments about, from your position, what it means and what we need to know? And does it really mean reductions in the police force? Where do we go from here? Let's see. I wonder. Okay, great. Dr. Nelson, Pastor Nelson, would you like to start?
Sure. I'd be happy to begin. First of all, just thank you so much for being here. It's quite an honor. In Cincinnati, we have had a historical issue with police officers here. If you were attentive to it, you may remember that in 2001, long before Black Lives Matter was a hashtag, that there was an unrest here in Cincinnati after the Cincinnati police had killed 11 unarmed Black men in a space of about 2.5 years, with no accountability for any of it. And so when the city council refused to act to hold the police accountable, the people sued the city and the police department. And there was unrest, there was civil unrest as a part of that. And so we have been in this fight for 20 years. And what we've seen is that over those 20 years, that every year Cincinnati has arrested, I believe the statistics are 70% of the arrests in Cincinnati have been of African Americans. 75% of the use of force cases have been against African Americans. 85% of the juvenile arrests have been of African Americans in a city that is 42% African American at its height and has been declining. Actually, the African American population has been decreasing over the last 20 years. And so we've had these deep historic inequities and police department that has refused to be held accountable, that has backed away from the negotiating table when people at the table were involved in protest, asking for police to be held accountable because they weren't, they didn't want to be at the table with particular individuals. And they've had really their run of the city. The city police department gets $151.6 million annually in our city budget, and all of health and human services combined get $6 million. And so what we have is a budget that is out of scope, a police force in Cincinnati that is much larger than it needs to be. I think we're about twice what the national average is as it relates to police to citizen ratio. And so what we said is that we need to defund the police. We need to restructure the way our city budget is to take money out of an overinflated police budget, with a police department that refuses to be held accountable for its actions, to right size the police department. And we are doing this because, number one, we know, and we've known for decades, that we can't arrest our way out of crime, that more police does not mean less crime, that the best way to reduce crime is to invest in a stable economy for all people, adequate housing, making sure people have health care, access to education, that when those things are provided and people have access to the things that tie us together, then crime goes down. And so what we are saying is take money out of a way of operating that is not going to be beneficial and put it in places that will be beneficial to making our neighborhoods and our communities truly safe.
Thank you so much, Pastor Nelson. Is there, Dr. Odom, did you want to respond to this conversation, this part of the conversation where we're really just understanding the defunding talk?
Yes. First of all, I would like to say thank you for having me here for this panel discussion. I think it's very important and a lot of issues are raised. The Defund the Police movement has caused or raised issues on both sides of the aisle, both Republican, Democrat, liberal, and in the public, to look at to say, what do we mean by defund? And there's so many different meanings of defund the police, even within parties, even within the public. Some people actually want to take money out. There are other politicians that have been on TV saying, no, we do not want to take money out of the budget. We just are upset with some of the acts that the police are doing. When we look at this, I say, yes, there needs to be police reform. There's no doubt about that. But I think when we look at this, sometimes we say, are we really saying defund the police or are we saying reform the police? Because there's a theory by somebody by the name of Joe Overton. And he says, and I'll read it, it says, the question window theory is the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time, also known as the window of discourse. And what he talks about is certain times we will reach for things that are unthinkable in order that we could get things that are sensible or acceptable when we look at these different things. I'm a person that I'm very much into data. I think decisions should be evidence-based and data-driven. And one of the things that I look at, say, for example, New York City, we have crime up over 400%. We have shootings up over 200% inside New York City. And as a former detective, it always would hurt my heart to go to these different scenes because as an African-American male and one who was raised in a housing project, to see this sort of tragedy that is taking place, because the numbers don't lie with a body. If it's a dead person, it's a dead person. There's no going around it. The mayor of Atlanta just was on TV on the news speaking about how she was upset about people killing one another because she said, it's not the police. We have to stop killing one another. In a unique way, I say, I throw this on the shoulders of the political leaders because, first of all, they are the ones who ultimately approve the budgets. As a chief and former commissioner, I used to have to review the budgets. And then it goes to them. They're the final say, the politicians. So the politicians, I always say to them, if you knew that there were issues that were wrong with policing, what have you done? If you didn't know, where have you been? Are local leaders reading the crime reports of their particular areas and districts that they represent? If they are reading them, are they proactive or are they reactive? If you know that there's certain services that are needed for your particular area, what are you doing about it to get these services to the area? So when we look at this, it tells us from the overtone theory that we're going to the unthinkable because there's so many other issues involved here. These issues didn't start with policing. These are other issues of society that's a reflection of what is happening in policing. Because the thing is this, as when the shooting took place with George Floyd, I was on TV saying how it was wrong, that was not proper police practices, and that he should be guilty. And I know in the United States Constitution, innocent until proven guilty, and you get all that. But from my practitioner sense, what he did was totally wrong, and I went on national TV to say that. So when we look at these things, I think that we need to look in our communities, We need to speak to our political leaders and also our religious leaders and get everybody involved to sit around the table. Because here's a question, and I'll stop at this one. Somebody else talk. I would say to political leaders, I would say, have you ever read the crime reports or statistics of the area that you represent? Have you ever read them? Have you ever went on a ride along with the police to see what they encounter and what they do out there? You expect the police to do so many different things. You expect us to be law enforcement. You expect us to be counselors. You expect us to deal with mental health counseling. You expect police officers to do all of those different things. And if these were issues before, why didn't, when they were approving budgets, that they allocated the proper resources there? Why is it seem that now people are pointing the finger at police and saying, we must take from your budget, as though, first of all, they approved it, and as though those different issues are being done by the police? Not at all. I reviewed budgets. I had to sit down with different mayors when I was a chief in the New York City Police Department. I had to sit down with mayors when we went over different budgets. So I think that people should examine the budgets, develop some metrics, look at it, and see where the resources are coming from, because it's not only from the police budget, there's other budgets out there where you're spending money and you're doing things. And lastly, I will say, when you say take money out of the budget and say you put it in the youth, definitely should be from the youth, but why does it have to come from the police budget? Why can't it come from another budget? And the thing is, this is that if you allocate money for people to play in the playgrounds, there's no correlation to say that crime is definitely going to go down because you have money for the parks to go down. Not at all. In New York City, when they first started their juvenile crime squad, I was a member of it. And the purpose of this was to find alternatives to incarceration for juveniles and to find programs that they could get in as opposed to being incarcerated. So I was involved in that process, and I loved it because I got a chance to help juveniles go into programs as opposed to being incarcerated. I'll stop there. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Odom. Dr. Al-Qadri, would you talk a little bit? We heard so far, we talked about, sort of this talk around defunding. Some of it includes the issues, community issues, other ways in which we sort of articulate or define this, operationalize this defunding perspective is really based on the issues, the unmet needs in communities. Maybe it's not really about policing. Could you share a little bit your perspective around defunding and what that means and how it relates to policy issues, that kind of thing?
Thank you, Jade, and thank you to the organizers of this important discussion, I think. So in a literal sense, when we talk about congressional language, right, this is in policy world, when we talk about defunding something, we talk about abolishing or suspending programs. If a policy is not funded, that doesn't happen, basically. But the practical meaning of defunding, as my colleagues have said, it really means reallocating and redirecting funding. I don't know that it's about creating new funding opportunities. I think it's about redirecting funding from police departments to other government agencies to create alternative approaches to policing, essentially. So just for context, LA budget allocates $3.1 billion to policing. That's B, like a billion, right? That's about a big chunk of the budget, almost like a quarter or more than a quarter of the budget. They spend about $30 million on economic development, about $81 million on housing. So a $100 million diversion from the LAPD is a drop in the bucket for that police force, right? You want to talk about how much we spend on police departments. And New York City, if you factor in the benefits and the fringes, they spend about $10 billion on policing a year, which is about 11% of the city's budget. So when we talk about defunding, we're really talking about alternative and non-policing ways of dealing with service calls and with calls to dispatch, basically. And the defunding movement is essentially a way to reduce the amount of money available to police departments, in my opinion, to do four things. One is slow down the militarization of police departments. The less funds they have, hopefully the less militarized these organizations become. And that's a serious problem. It's about the unnecessary and excessive use of force, particularly against individuals and communities of color. And, we talk excessive use of force, we're talking deadly use of force in many cases, and that's not good. It's about reducing the reliance on policing in situations that really don't necessarily require policing. And it's about investing in alternative policing tools, which we can talk about later in this conversation. Let's talk a little bit about militarization of policing. I mean, this is the London Metropolitan Police Department principles when it was started in 1829. We call them the Peel's Principles of Policing, right? They emphasize crime prevention, public approval, willing cooperation of the public, and minimal use of physical force. If police departments were doing that today, we would not have any movements and any problems with police departments, right? So these are the foundational principles of police departments. But unfortunately, particularly in the US, there's been a shift toward militarization that started in the 90s, in response to, started in the 60s in response to different events that didn't really require policing, that was more about structural problems of racism and poverty and issues like that. SWAT units were introduced then. Today, about 60% of the 15,000 or so local governments or local police departments have SWAT units. I mean, 60%. Can you imagine? I mean, who needs SWAT units? SWAT units were supposed to be things that they would use to deal with hostage situations and barricade excessive use of weapons, right? So this is barricade people with weapons. This is why we needed them. And 60% of the 15,000 local enforcement departments have SWAT units today, which is a problem. The U.S. military surplus program has given about $4.3 billion of equipment to local law enforcement agencies. My best example of this is Coral Gables, Florida, where the busiest call is an identity theft call for police departments. Had 2 tanks at some point, or 2 armored vehicles, rather. I mean, why do they need 2 armored vehicles in Coral Gables, Florida? But that's happening all over the country. And between 97 and 2004, the military has been giving, instead of scrapping these old machines, they've been giving them to local governments, which arguably makes more money in parts and things like that to the manufacturers of these armored vehicles and other military equipment. So we also cannot deny the lack of gun control laws, and I'm going to be on the police side here for a second. The lack of gun control laws has affected the militarization movement. Lack of police action on gun control has left police departments with little choice but to get the bigger guns, right? It's as the guns in the street got bigger, you can get those at Walmart even. The police department wanted bigger guns, so we had like an arms race between the streets and the police departments. It's not, that doesn't justify militarization of police departments, but that ties the police militarization to the gun control laws, I think, that's a tie that needs to be made, I think. And we're mistaken in not making those connections today if we don't. So militarization does not help protect police officers. It does not help community members in most cases. Militarized units are more likely to be deployed in Black neighborhoods than anywhere else. They were initially, again, developed to deal with hostage situations. Today, they're sent to deal with small issues. I mean, they're no longer, for search and seizure warrants, they're sending military forces basically into the community. So that's really one of the problems. The second problem that I'll talk about here, and then we'll leave the rest for later, is the unnecessary use of force and the deadly use of force in many cases. Not all use of force is unjustified, by the way. I mean, there are situations where use of force is important. and there are situations where you need policing. But we have problems where traffic stops and minor petty theft are resulting in excessive use of force, and they're resulting in deadly use of force in some situations. The latest of which is George Floyd's death. But there are many that happened since then. So at the risk of oversimplifying here, we have a problem with organizational culture and a problem with policies and procedures, neither of which is going to be resolved by defunding the police department. LAPD, reducing LAPD's budget by 3% is not going to address this unnecessary use of force problem that we have. So we need to be careful with that, I think. What will help, and what has helped in the past, is changing policies on rules of engagement in the street. How we handle minor offenses and traffic stops and things like that. There are clear policies that can be very effective. So Campaign Zero has done a lot of research on this. More restrictive use of force has been shown to be associated with fewer police-involved killings, and that's important to note here. Police units could place evidence-informed restrictions on police use of force that are designed to significantly reduce police violence in communities. So police culture is another problem, and that's really the elephant in the room here. This is very complicated, and defunding, again, is not going to resolve this problem that we have in police departments. Responsibility lies on this general police culture that has shifted police training from community policing strategies and the things that Peel talked about in 1829 to militarization culture. I mean, and that could be there could be an easy shift there into training to de-escalate situations in police policies and procedures manuals and police academies and places like that. But the more complicated cultural problem is police attitude toward black residents particularly. There's this unmistakable tendency to use excessive or deadly force against black residents than white residents, right? So a white mass murderer is probably more likely to escape police bullets than a black traffic offender or a petty criminal there. So this is a serious problem that we have. I mean, and we can name the white mass murderers who walked out of situations in handcuffs instead of on a stretcher, right? So this is we can look at that. I mean, well, many of them killed themselves, but that's a different problem. The police didn't do that to them. So I would argue here that the abolishing movement will be far more effective. So we shouldn't be talking in those situations where we have a police culture problem. We should not be just talking about defunding. We should be really talking about abolishing a police force and restarting a police force, a police organization, which is exactly what happened in Camden, by the way. Camden in 2012 abolished its police department and got rid of the police union, and they restarted a new department, which resulted in great outcomes. I think half of the crime rate was slashed. They have less problems after the reset, basically, that they had. So if the problem is cultural, it's the culture of the police department, that is not going to be fixed by taking away some of their funding. If the problem is with rules of engagement, that's an easier problem to solve, and police departments should be forced to make those changes to the rules of engagement. So these are the two sort of things that I want to say on this defunding movement and the importance of getting to these issues, these two big issues, when it comes to that. Again, there are two other issues that I'll talk about later, which is the reducing of reliance on policing in situations that don't require policing, and investing in alternative policing tools, which is what my colleagues talked about mostly.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I appreciate these opening comments that you've made. I think that for a lot of us, we saw America's racial reckoning. We saw for 8 minutes and 46 seconds what racism looks like. We know that we are intolerant now of racial discrimination. We see racial discrimination in healthcare and education and housing and employment. And we also see it in policing, painfully so. I think that this panel is really focused on social equity, social justice, and social movements. And the conversation around defunding is not something we can move away from. I know that we talked a little bit about the way in which resources are allocated. So if some of the issue is culture, right? And we saw that. We saw the unrest in Minneapolis. We saw the intervening police officers, or the failure of police officers to intervene in a crisis situation. We see the abuse of power or abuse of authority on TV. We also see police brutality, right? But if we think that this is a organizational cultural issue, right? What could we do if we sort of pivot a little bit, move money in a certain direction? Pastor Nelson, you talked about the community context. So if we are looking to shift resources in an area that's really needed, where would those additional funds go, and how might the allocation work? What would it look like? So who would decide, and where would it go? Could you share a little bit your perspective, Pastor Nelson?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about first and foremost is about the creation of stable jobs. That the unemployment rates in the African American community are always higher than they are in the country at large. While I believe it was March, the president was talking about maybe it was February. There was a month early this year where the president was talking about how the economy was growing overall, but the numbers for African American unemployment had risen while unemployment in the rest of the country had gone down. And that's not an unfamiliar situation. So we have to create jobs and create livable wage jobs. The fact that the largest growing sector of the employment is in the service economy does not help people who need to be able to provide housing for themselves, be able to provide to feed families, and God forbid somebody would want to live in a neighborhood that has a quality public school system. That becomes a whole nother bridge to cross. I think we ought to take much more seriously than we do in our national conversations the idea of a guaranteed basic income. Dr. King wrote about how our dependency on military spending as a nation was going to lead us to moral bankruptcy, and that we needed to reduce our military spending and invest in creating a guaranteed basic income for every person. And I think we need to take that very seriously in the time and right now as we think about the way that global markets have shifted, the fact that state and local officials have been caught between reopening an economy in a pandemic so that people could work because there's not enough federal money coming to allow people to stay at home and stay out of poverty. And so it's time to really reevaluate those things. There was a comment earlier about defunding being reaching for the unthinkable so that we can get something more reasonable. And I actually think that right now what we've been doing is our conversations have been limited to what is palatable. And we have to expand the conversation to not just what is incrementally palatable, but what we need in order to survive and thrive in the Black community and as a nation. And these major steps, thinking about a guaranteed basic income, these things that months ago were unthinkable in the public conversation. These things, we need to have serious conversations about moving in that direction. Otherwise, the culture will win. And I think the defunding is the way to attack the culture of policing, because the reason the culture has not changed has not been because there haven't been reforms. We have had reform after reform. We've had body cameras and non-lethal measures of intervention. We've had training. We've had bias training and cultural awareness training. We've done all kinds of things to help reform policing, but the culture is ingrained because the money keeps going. There is not an incentive to change. And that's why defunding is important. Police unions have entirely too much power over city governments. And part of how we begin to break that power is to take away the money that goes into policing and use that money to do the other work that's entirely necessary.
Thanks so much, Pastor Nelson. I'm going to pivot a little bit. I know that Dr. Odom, you are a former police officer, well aware of budgets in your capacity as commissioner. And in a lot of ways, I say you're knowledgeable about what the community context looks like, what the culture is, right? And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, still on the allocation of resources. So what would be your answer to the question around, should funding be reallocated to non-police areas? And if so, where do you think the unmet need is? And we know that you're not speaking for all of America, but certainly for the context of New York City, given the time that you spent there, maybe you could share a little bit about your perspective on that question.
First of all, one of the things when we deal with budgets and what's going on, one of the key things is, as someone stated earlier, when they spoke about policies and procedures, and that's a key impact on it, because one of the things that you've seen the police unions speak about, and here's the thing that's very positive, they would say, we have goals that they have to meet, and officers were given goals, and it's been in all the newspapers in New York City. You have to write 50 summonses a month. You have to have a certain amount of arrests. So you're basically telling officers, in order for them to meet their standards, they have to go out there and write summonses. They have to go out there and make arrests, or else they don't meet standards and they lose their jobs. So you're putting officers in a position that causes friction with the public, because you're saying you must go and write summonses. And one of the things I spoke about is that summonses generate revenues for the city. Whenever police officers got the blue flu and they did not write summonses, New York City got in an uproar, the political establishment. Why? Because if you have 40,000 officers writing a minimum of 50 summonses a month, and each summons, the lowest one is $60, you know how much money that revenue that generates for the city. If the officers don't do that, it would be a calamity. Everybody would be upset. You better get them out there. You better make sure that they're writing summonses. So you put the officers in a position that causes friction with the community. Officers don't want to write summonses in disenfranchised areas, and any areas they don't want to write any summonses. But you want them to do that. Then you say you have to have a minimum of a certain amount of rest. So you tell an officer, if you don't have a certain amount of rest, you're not meeting your goals. And so therefore, we're going to put you on probation or you're going to lose your job. So that's one of the parts that people don't talk about. You know, you hear from the officers and then it dies down. And that impacts everything that is taking place that's going on out there. And another thing with the culture, if you didn't force officers or make it mandatory for them to write summonses to make arrests, we wouldn't have a lot of these issues. This would help to resolve a lot of issues if you can say you must go out there and do these different things. And yes, some of them I agree are over budgeted with the militarization and things of that nature. I understand that. But once again, that comes from the political leaders. The police officers do not go out and buy tanks themselves. They have to be given the tanks, so they're not out there buying any of the tanks, as some people would believe that they go out there and buy the tanks. The other thing, when we look at the different budget allocations, when we have this, the part that people don't factor in when they look at the budget of how much money is going to the police department, they don't factor in how much revenue generating the police department is for them. Like I said, for example, New York City, with approximately 40,000 officers, and you have those officers writing a minimum of 50 summonses per month, a requirement, or you fall below the standards, and each summons minimum is $60, and some of them are $200 and $300. You know how much money how much revenue that generates for the city? And if the officers didn't do that, the city would lose money, but then the officers will have less contacts with the public, and also contacts that can become confrontational. So we, somehow or another, we don't know about that part of the policy and procedure that impacts where these allocation of resources are going. Also, when we look at officers out there, earlier we spoke a little bit about Camden. Camden was just on the news about their new police department because what they found out that the majority of their police department was white, and they somehow or another discriminated against hiring officers of color on their police department when they did this reestablishment in Camden. So they did a whole special on it recently on the news about a week or 2 weeks ago about the Camden Police Department with them dealing with that type of thing. The budget, when you have the budget, you must take into consideration, the response of the officers, what they're doing, and not only that, from another part, what are they asked to do? What's required of the officer when they go out there? Officers, from policies and procedures, you have something called duties and responsibilities. Part of my career as a police academy instructor, I taught the subject police science, which dealt with the policies and procedures of the police department and what you have to do when you're out there on patrol and any type of access. So when we look at this and we talk about the budget, people forget about that summons part, that revenue generating that the police department does for the cities in which they serve, especially in New York City. So yes, there is a big budget. Yes, the police officers are required to do a lot of things. And when we talk about the different things, I say about life, people should go out there and try to recruit people to become police officers. Right now, it's hard. The recruitment is tough because people don't want to do it because they're ostracized in the public and they think all these different things. How many people I've done it for over 20 years, that receive a call, shots fired, man with a gun, and they run towards the danger and in it. I've been shot at before. I know what it's like to run there to try to help somebody else because somebody is shooting at them or somebody shot them. I ran towards the danger. It's not enough money that you could give me to take my life. There's not enough. We run towards the danger. That's the part they look about. Data, you want to look at numbers? I love numbers from an academic standpoint of view. Look at the police department, approximately 40,000 members. 98% of NYPD officers themselves go 20 years or more without firing their weapon one time while on duty. Without firing their weapon one time, no shootings over 20 years. That's the number people don't look at. You have to, when people analyze this, I always believe in a scholar-practitioner approach. I think the scholars need to sit down with the practitioners and also with the community leaders to help to resolve this issue. One by itself is not going to resolve these issues, not at all. Everybody needs to sit down to the table so the academics can come up with the ideals, evaluate the studies, look at what's going on. The clergy could talk to the people in the community, the religious flock, and how they could talk to people and get the community organized together. The officers are the practitioners. When you look at it, we're the pawns. You hire us, you tell us, go out there and you better do this. If you don't do this, you don't have your job. And then you blame me after you told me to go out there and make arrests and write summonses, a mandatory. There's a sheet, your monthly activity. And on that monthly activity, it says how many arrests you made, how many summons you issued. If not, you fell below the applicable standard of care. This is the part people leave out, or they're misinformed about, or they don't know. And as an officer and as a chief, I had to look at these reports. I had to review the budget to see where it's reallocated at. Are we using our resources properly, right? Like I said, we don't go out and buy tanks ourselves. They give it to us. They say, here's a tank. That's it. Equipment we get, we don't go out there and buy any of this stuff ourselves. They give it to us, and they expect us to respond to these situations. People forget about the first attempt on the World Trade Center bomb in 1993. People forget about 9/11 when police officers ran there. And it bothers me and it disturbs me when people say, this is the job you took. This is what you're supposed to do. Yeah, I'm supposed to get shot at. I'm supposed to be shot because I took this job. Not at all. This is a societal issue, and we all need to work about this or to resolve this together, not one by itself. So when I look at these things, I will stop looking at the budget. It's approved by the politicians. They review it, they sign off on it. We do not make up the budgets ourselves. So if there's an issue with the budget, we need to look at the political people who sign off on the budgets and approve these budgets. Remember, public servants, you sign off on it, you give us the money, and you say, write summonses, arrest people, you better do this or else. That's the part of the equation that a lot of people are missing and they don't understand.
Dr. Odom, thank you very much for your discussion on the topic of allocation of resources. You know, we said early on when we organized this session that this is a discussion, it is not a debate. We know that there are a lot of things as academics we need to know about this movement, right? The way the conversation is going and the action strategy. It's almost an outside-inside strategy for change, right? There are quite a few of us who agree that we need to take action now, but you know, there's a conversation that needs to be had initially. So this is initial conversation. I think that in our standing panel, we'll have other conversations. I want to talk a little bit about evidence-based decision-making. Some people on this call and people who will hear our discussion today really are like me. My superpower is an evaluator. I appreciate police who run into danger, but I also appreciate the community context where people fear law enforcement. And so I wonder if we reallocate resources or provide additional resources where there is an unmet need. I wonder, how do we judge success? What are some measures that we could use? How do we know that the reallocation is the right strategy to move us in the right direction? Dr. Al-Qadri, could you talk a little bit about evidence-based decision-making, how we know whether or not we're winning or losing? Maybe that's not the right way to see this perspective, but how do we know that the change we made is the right change? What do you think?
Unmute myself.
Thank you.
This is becoming a trend. If I get $1 every time I say I forgot to unmute myself every day, I'll be a rich person. But that's so 9 out of 10 encounters in some police departments are, or 9 out of 10 calls for service in some police departments are not for violent crimes, and they don't require necessarily a gun to be presented at the situation. So if we want to talk about evidence-based, we should start with analyzing our calls for service and figure out how we've been responding to these calls for service and what are the outcomes of these calls for service. And we can do that today. We can do it after we implement changes, whether it's defunding or diverting funds into social programs or diverting funds into hiring social workers instead of hiring police officers in the police department. Sometimes that could work, right? You don't want a call to a child abandonment situation to have 20 officers and no social worker to be found. or they'll sit there and wait for a social worker to show up for a couple hours because there aren't enough social workers out there. So that's where we need to start, I think, if we're talking about evidence-based practices and keeping tabs on on whether or not we're having a successful outcome. So we start with that as a baseline, and we continue to monitor that as we move forward. We can always look at patrol statistics and analyze the encounters to determine whether escalation where it occurs was warranted. We need to analyze targeted policing actions, and use of force is recorded. We can always monitor that. Not all use of force, as I said earlier, is unjustified, but higher numbers of use of force and how that affects different communities or people of color particularly can be an indicator that force is unnecessarily being used. So there are a lot of red flags that we already have data on, I think, and success there is evaluated by looking at the trend and benchmarking against peers on all of these things. So it's, how we can really start doing that today. There's no reason, this is a situation where we can flatten the curve on day one of taking action, right? We're talking a lot about flattening the curve these days. We can flatten the curve on day one, we can flatten the curve by changing police policies and procedures and engagement, rules of engagement on the street. We can flatten the curve on day one by sending the right people to these calls for service, or going into a response to a call for service with an attitude that this is not a violent situation. I don't need to escalate this situation, and monitoring who's been escalating and who hasn't been escalating. I mean, there are police officers who have 17 or 18 complaints on them, and they're still on the street. So there's a lot that can be done there. That's all I have for now.
Thank you very much. Pastor Nelson, did you want to talk a little bit about how we judge success, especially from the community context?
Yeah, I think success is judged by having stronger, safer communities. I think success is judged by the number of people who are able to be full participants in the economy, in the political system, by the health and vibrancy of the community. I think we judge it by the strength of the schools in the community, by the safety of children in the community. I think those are measures that we can use to address to measure our success and our impact. And because when we do that, I firmly believe when we do those things, when we focus on those, that the crime rates will go down, the need for policing goes down. And so I think if we can look at those measures, the quality of life measures, jobs, housing, education, people's engagement in community, those will give us good measures of our success.
Thank you so much. I sent a little chat out, a note in the chat box that in the interest of time, we want to definitely make sure that we have a conversation that extends beyond our invited speakers and the panel organizers to all of the folks who are either members of the standing panel or people who are guests today. I wonder, Margaret, would you help a little bit fielding some questions that have been sent in the chat? I know that we had a few people already lined up who would like to ask a question. So we're at the point now where we could unmute some people to allow them to ask questions, and I'll continue to monitor the chat to make sure that other questions are discussed as well. Margaret?
Thank you, Jade. I think we've got a lot of issues on the table in this discussion already. And I see that Ron Carley and Costas Torrega have already started a conversation about a little bit about success and a little bit about police unions. So Ron, do you want to start?
Thank you. I guess where I would go first is around the evidence-based decision-making. And the most significant effort that I've seen in my long career in local government was around President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. So we're a few years out from that now. It has not been picked up by the current administration, but a lot of police departments did adopt or began to adopt a lot of those reforms that were in that report. What research does anyone know about with regard to what's been adopted, what hasn't, what has worked? Has it made any changes whatsoever, or do we need to start over again with a different kind of commission to provide some national guidance, or do we just have to do this one city, town, and village at a time?
Costas, did you want to build on that?
Yeah, and I think Ron is giving us a good platform. It's always my belief that NAPA as an organization should focus on administrative resolutions of public issues, not on policy promotion. As a consequence, the report that Ron, for example, mentioned and its implementation leads to the question, who's responsible for implementing presidential commission reports? Certainly the current administration may not be interested in implementing an Obama commission report, but there's got to be a better way forward. And because we mentioned the union, and because Dr. Odom, you were very eloquent about the policeman side of the perspective, which is sometimes lost in the public press. I wonder if we can look at the other side, which is the structural impediments to managing the police force in an effective way. I posted in the chat a blog post by a fellow by the name of Adam Pagnucco here in the Washington, D.C. area that details the FOP agreement with Montgomery County, Maryland, a huge organization, over $6 billion budget, a huge police budget. And when you walk down that list of potential kind of gaps, if you will, of reliable communication between management and union, you see a lot of things that management has their hands tied in terms of their ability to implement change. And we're here to talk about implementing change. The Black Lives Movement has been a wake-up call, and we have to be thinking about what kind of change can we make. And in NAPA, the kind of change we can make is administrative, implementing union contracts in the right way, creating community review boards to look at excessive violence and so on. These are the kinds of things that administrators can do. Rather than implement, let's say, a society policy. Surely we can all participate in that policy discussion, but NAPA has its focus on administration of the public good. Those are the kinds of things that I hope our excellent speakers can focus with us on. Thank you.
I'd like to build a little bit on this question of evidence and implementation, because underlying one of the assumptions about defunding the police and moving resources to other places is that that economic deprivation leads to crime, and that crime is what's driving increased police engagement and arrests. But there's some evidence that while reported crimes have gone down, that arrests and incarceration have continued to go up. So when we start thinking about what we need to change, how do we use some of the evidence that we have, and how do we create other evidence to help us understand where we should be going? And I don't know if any of our speakers want to start off with responding to that before we look at any general discussion.
I have a little bit, just quickly, a few thoughts on that. One is we've seen that same trend here in Cincinnati, that as the crime rate has gone down, the role of policing has not gone down with it. And this is one of the challenges that we've had in the city. Just in the past 2 days, there have been 2 deep investigative reports in Cincinnati, in the Cincinnati Enquirer. One looked at between 2015 and 2020, there have been 101 recommendations that were issued from the Citizens Complaint Authority, from the citizen-led investigative body that has no authority over the police. It can only make recommendations. And so it's between 2015 and 2020, there have been 101 recommendations made by the Citizens Complaint Authority, and none of them have been taken by the police here in Cincinnati. They've all been ignored. Many of them are repeat suggestions or repeat recommendations because the same issues have come up year after year. And so this is part of the context of this current conversation, is that we've had recommendations. We have a body who's responsible for making recommendations, but it has been up to the police department itself to be willing to adopt and make those, and ours has been unwilling, which has been part of the challenge. And so that's the context that we find ourselves in that serious tension, where and the second article said pretty much the same thing, is that other calls that have been made for reform and for change have largely gone unheard. And so then we as citizens are left with how do we resolve this when our police department is unresponsive to the mechanisms that we have put in place to try to work alongside of it, which is why we've gone to the action of defunding, and why, to Dr. Odom's point, I think he's exactly right. That's not a conversation with the police. That's a conversation with politicians, and why we've been engaging in very deep and serious conversations with our politicians about how they are managing the city's money.
I just would like to add on, and I agree with everything what he just said. And the other thing is that when you're looking at this, say, for example, as I stated earlier, in New York City, crime is up. Shootings are up over 200% over the 4th of July weekend, and gunshot wounds are up over 230% over the 4th of July weekend inside New York City. Chicago over the 4th of July weekend had 77 people shot, 14 killed. New York City had 42 shot and 9 killed over the 4th of July weekend. So when we look at the different things, and as I was stating earlier with the policy, if you stop police officers from saying mandatory that you write a minimum of 50 summonses per month, just think about it. 40,000 officers writing 50 summonses. That means 40,000 officers must have at least 50 contacts with the public over something that's bad. Minimum 40,000 officers with a minimum of 50 contacts for summonses alone. Then after the summonses alone, now you have to have a certain amount of arrests per month. Now that's more contacts that you have with the public as opposed to if something happens and you receive the call, then you respond, as opposed to saying, I have to meet my numbers. I must go out and look. I must hunt. I must make sure that I get these summonses so that I can meet my quota so that I'm okay and I will be able to maintain my job. So that's an issue. Once again, that's the police officers do not make up the numbers that I have to go out and write a certain amount of numbers. I have to write a certain amount of arrests. And then when you look at the barometer and the rewards in police departments is this: in order to go to specialized units, you have to be able to write a certain amount of summonses. You have to write a certain amount of arrests in order to get to a specialized unit. So if you're just a regular officer engaging with the public, being the community-oriented officer, you don't have any numbers that warrant for you to go to a specialized unit. So therefore, you're basically either stuck or you're ridding up because you have not met the standards. If the standards were changed by the political leaders that oversee the departments and saying, look, you don't have to go out there and write 50 summonses. If you see one and it's a violation, then you can do it. You don't have to go out there and make a minimum of 3 arrests a month. If an arrest comes, you have to make it, and there's no other alternative, then you make it. Police officers are put in a lose-lose situation with that. If I don't have 50 summonses, if I don't have a certain amount of arrests, I'm bad. I think that is wrong. Absolutely wrong, because that damages our relationship with the public. And what it does is every time they have an encounter with officers, it's a negative encounter. It's not like we come into birthday party celebrations. It's not like we're coming to cookouts. We coming to give you a summons or we're coming to arrest you, right? And then when we get the call over the radio, the call is not come to a party, come to a community center. The call is there's an issue, there's a problem, respond now. That's the calls that we receive. We don't go out and look and say, let me make something happen, get a crystal ball. The call comes to us on these situations. The directives, like I said, it rolls from the top down, right? Summonses. You've seen it, if you've been reading the newspapers in the past, you'll see officers get the blue flu. They're mad. Officers are not writing summonses, because the city is losing money, generation. And when the officers speak up about, I have to write summonses, I have to make arrests, then they get demonized or they get punished by the structure itself. So if up top is concerned, the political leaders that are in charge of this, they should say, you don't have to write summonses. It's not mandatory for arrest. If you drop that, just do basic math. 40,000 officers times a minimum of 50 contacts each police officer. And that's on summonses alone. I think that will help resolve a lot of issues, and that will resolve a lot of things with the encounters that are going on and negative interactions with police officers.
Thank you very
I think
much, Dr. Odom. I do want to say that, while we talk about the problems, the practices, the policies, and refocus toward administrative action, I do want to remind everyone on the call today that this is just the first of multiple conversations needed as we think about administrative recommendations or executive action that's really needed during this time. I do have a question from one of our standing panel members, a few of them actually. And so I'm going to unmute Dr. Gooden. Susan Gooden is the dean of the Wilder School, and she has a question that is she's going to ask, and she may involve another member of our panel, Dr. Myers, in the conversation as well. Dr. Gooden?
Thanks so much, Dr. Barry James, and thanks to you for organizing this outstanding panel and for each of the speakers. So my question really is to follow up on a point raised by Reverend Pierce, and I put it in the chat function, and I would also be curious on Professor Myers' take on this question as well, as an Academy Fellow and the Roy Wilkins Professor at the University of Minnesota, who's a well-respected economist, in terms of the relationship between crime and from unemployment and crime, and not just unemployment, but employment opportunities that provide wages and income and a package of benefits that are akin to being able to support a family. Because I was teaching a course this summer and had a couple of police officers in my class, and they made the very same point that at the root of a lot of arrests and a lot of behavior when you talk with offenders, it is about this need to be a provider, particularly for males, to be able to provide for their families. There are, child support obligations and responsibilities that should be there, as well as just being able to provide and survive and thrive as everyone wants to do. And then this is coupled by when people are released, then not being able to get employment. And we've seen some movement there about, eliminating the box for checking whether you've been a convicted felon or not. But still, that is a huge barrier. Even if we go back to Padger's work and study about it's easier for a white male with a convicted felon to get a job than it is than a black man with no record. And I thought that was just a huge study that still resonates across time. So I'm just curious if you could talk about this in more detail, if there are any policy interventions that you are aware of that are sort of linking these two, or what we might expect from that. And again, so I'm directing this to Reverend Pierce, and I'm also hoping that Dr. Myers would be willing to respond as well. Thanks.
It's a great question. One of the things that we're beginning to think about here is what would forward-thinking legislation look like that would create an earnings tax to provide a type of reparations fund that would go to the purposes of being able to fund employment for individuals. Because, this is what you are saying, what you are hearing is the same thing that we are saying and hearing. Our Black police group, they're not quite a union, but the organization of Black police officers here have been very vocal that they support the redirection of money if it goes towards employment, number one, because they're seeing the same things. Is that, the unfortunate truth is the underground economy is always hiring. And so we have to be able to provide ways to create jobs. And so that's one of the things is, can we create an earnings tax that provides money to help create stable employment? It's one of the reasons I also think we need to have more conversations about universal basic income, is because as globalization continues to happen, and I was just driving through the other day, I was up on the other side of the state, driving through Warren, Ohio. And Warren, Ohio is a ghost town of what it used to be, because all of the factory jobs that once made Warren a thriving city have moved. And then all of the secondary places that depended on the factory jobs, the bars, the restaurants, the dry cleaners, the daycare centers, those places are boarded up, and those buildings have been in disrepair for 20 years. And so, and the people who once lived there, their children are trying to get as far away from Warren as possible because there is no economy there. And so, and this is happening in cities and towns all across the United States. It's going to move its way into our major cities. They are going to be impacted by this sooner rather than later. And so we need to think about, what does it look like to create an economy that says that the fact that you exist means you have a right to live well. And it is not tied to your productivity and a capitalist system that is unsustainable. And so, so part of that, I think, is dramatically rethinking what is our social contract with one another.
So, thank you very much, Dane Garten, for raising this provocative question, and thank you very much, Reverend Pierce, for pointing out that there's a connection, between poverty, employment, and crime. But actually, we're having two separate conversations. One conversation has to do with what are some of the determinants of crime, and how do we address the underlying, core problems of disadvantage in our communities. And so I too have had police officers in my class, and many of the progressive police officers have adopted this view that it's not really about policing. It's not really about law enforcement. Rather, it's about poverty. It's about jobs. And it's actually sounds quite progressive to have a police officer say, I think the root cause of these racial disparities in criminal justice system is poverty. That's one conversation. But then the second conversation has to do with the origins of the police department, the role that policing has played within Black America. And it turns out that policing is not really just about crime. It's also about control. It's about dominance. And it turns out that if you look historically at the patterns of relationship expenditures on police departments and the levels of criminal activity, that the direction of causation isn't always, the direction of causation it's not always policing reduces crime. It sometimes goes in the direction of crime produces policing. So the things that Black people did became crimes. And so the vacancy laws, just the idea of standing around on the corner, these are the types of things that produced employment for police. And economists have begun to explore more deeply the perverse incentives that police departments have to arrest people for doing things that, to arrest Blacks, to doing things that most other people would get a pass for. So the first time I got stopped by a police officer, I was driving from Morgan State to Delaware State. And so Morgan State is a Black college, Delaware State's a Black college. It's nothing but white rural areas in between. And it turns out that after I finished the activity that was at Delaware State and I was returning, I made a left-hand turn from the rural road onto the highway. There was no stop sign, so I just could kind of slowed down and I proceeded. And I got stopped. And I was taken to the jail, and I was informed that you pay the fine or you go to jail. And I said, well, I'd like to try to plead my case. And I said, well, it's not until Monday where you can plead your case. But what I discovered was that this rural white county that's in Delaware received its revenues from stopping people. And most of the people they stopped were Black people who were driving from Delaware State back to other places like Philadelphia and Baltimore and so forth. And so if you think about how do we fund police departments, what is the basis for producing the revenues? In many instances, it's so perverse, it provides the baked-in incentives to disproportionately arrest African Americans. So I want to try to separate these two conversations. One conversation has to do with what is the relationship between employment, poverty, schooling, and criminal activity. It's real. I'm not going to dismiss it. I spent half of my life doing analysis of it. But then there's another story here. And this is, what about policing? What is it about policing that sometimes seems to disproportionately stop Black people? And the answer is that it's really deeply rooted into the core functions of policing as control. And so I would recommend that we try to keep these two conversations separately and not create this kind of progressive liberal veneer that somehow by shifting resource allocations from the police department to anti-poverty programs or labor markets, that we solve the more perverse problem of what is the nature of policing in America.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Myers. I was trying to type in the chat and respond to things. I do want to say that we are we're clear in our first discussion that this is it's a crucial conversation that we need to have as we understand where we are with things. I am reminded that Representative Bass from California said that we're at a point where we need to make a point or make a difference, right? And this is very distinguished about, where we are with things. I know that we're clear about the role of the academy, but we're also clear about the need to have a discussion so that we understand what the issues are. There are so many issues that need to be vetted, right, and discussed, and also administrative action that really needs to be recommended. We have a problem where it's really important for us to address it, right? In all of the ways in which we do that, make meaningful change occur. And so your comment and Dr. Gooden's comment about, the incentives for policing, very important, especially given the community context, the programs that are available, the policies that are in play, and the administrative action that's expected. And so thank you so much for making those comments and directing us in a meaningful way. We had a few other questions or issues that some wanted to discuss. But in the interest of time, we have a few more minutes. And so I want to pivot back to this discussion we were having on evidence-based decision-making to give Dr. Al-Qadri an opportunity to talk a little bit about his perspective in terms of, how we judge success, given the context of our conversation with panel members and guests today.
Unmute myself.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So this is, there are some easier targets than others. I agree with Professor Myers on what he said, that there are two separate conversations. I think nobody should be against investing in employment programs and in investing in education programs and in more social workers and more alternatives to policing, investment in communities. I think nobody should be against that. I don't know that there's data that says that could lead to lowering crime or increasing crime. And I think we need to be careful with not setting goals like that, I think. And if we do that, then we could see an investment in communities that doesn't result in reducing crimes. And there's another side to this conversation, which is what police departments do. And that is an easier target for us in terms of evaluating success. I think nobody has said stop and frisk so far in this conversation. Stop and frisk is about administrative actions, right? This is about administrators, police officers, street-level bureaucrats, as Lipsky would have called them, right? Who stop people. And it just so happens that in a city like New York City, 90% of the people stopped were Black or brown people. And the vast majority of these stops resulted in nothing, but 10% of these stops resulted in petty crimes and in things that they would have not covered. So this is targeting policing and pretextual stops and consent searches and stop and frisk like policies result in over-criminalization of people of color and communities of color. And I think we can reduce those on day one. we should be able to see results and better outcomes. And that's what I was trying to say earlier with flattening the curve. These are results that we can see immediately.
Thank you very much. Margaret, do we have another question that we can do?
I don't know whether it's me, Jade, but I didn't hear the rest of your question.
Undoubtedly, okay. It's my connection. Is there another question that we wanted to address at this particular time?
I think we covered most of the things that I jotted down after listening to the initial conversation. But certainly the conversation does, I think that there is one question that was previously addressed, and I don't know if there's any need to expand on it. It was a question that Marilyn Rubin raised, but I think we did discuss some of the issues she raised in terms of having the specific targets. So I'm not sure we need to elaborate on that, but if anybody, Marilyn, if you would like to have somebody elaborate on that, you can nod your head. I think you're unmuted, so if you wanted to see if we wanted to build on the earlier points that were made by Dr. Odom and others.
Yes, thank you. It was interesting for me. I mean, for part of this, I was only able to listen to the audio and missed seeing everybody. But thank you. This was really, I guess Dr. Odom would be the person that would be most directly affected by this. I was a professor at John Jay College for 30 years. And so had interactions with lots and lots of police officers, and really was exposed to a wide range of them, and learned a lot about how they felt about policing the community. But what I'm really interested in is your discussion on the requirements put on police about having to make arrests, and I'm very familiar with this. But I also see, can you tie that at all to the issue of police culture? I mean, I just would like to hear a little bit more discussion on police culture and what happens when police officers go through the academy for their training. I've heard various opinions on how much they have been exposed to diversity, what kinds of how they when they run into issues in the community, to whom can they speak. But I would just love you to speak a little bit more about police culture, and if you see that at all tied into the to what's put on them in terms of having to make a certain number of arrests. Thank you.
Yes, definitely it's tied into the culture. One of the unique things that I always said about policing, especially in New York City, because what happens is officers who got in trouble for abuse of force or too many stop, question, and frisk, I was a consultant that dealt with the Simon Wiesenthal Tolerance Center, where we had to retrain these officers, go over different issues as far as racial profiling, criminal profiling, and their interactions. And one of the things that I personally discovered myself was that when you look at police officers, you talk about a culture, go look at police officers that work in Central Park on Fifth Avenue and by the UN. They have a totally different perspective on policing. Their perspective is, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. Where's the caviar? The caviar is over here. That's their perspective because their interactions on Fifth Avenue is totally different. So if you want to talk about a culture, look at the cops that work by the UN or on Fifth Avenue. They have a totally different culture and a totally different concept than police officers who may work in, well, the term we used to use in the 80s, we used to use the term A house, meaning very busy. Say, for example, one year I worked in a precinct in Brooklyn and we had over 400 murders, right? I worked where I had my memo book with that within an 8-hour tour. I would have 20 to 40 incidents that I respond to, and none of them were to say hello, but it was either a shooting, a stabbing, or something like that going on. So we know we have precincts that were labeled A House that had those type of interactions, as opposed to Central Park or Midtown South or by the UN, where they didn't have those type of interactions, nor did they have to respond to basically any type of call, except for maybe the dog is missing or something happened with the dog or the tree guard outside. So you have different cultures within inside there, depending on where you work at. Also, what's left out of the equation when we talk about this culture, the mental health aspect of it. As a police officer, it's frowned upon to show that you have issues or weakness. You have to keep on going. Nobody has been concerned about the trauma of police officers who work in these areas that day after day you respond to scenes, shooting, murder, a robbery, and you go to this and you work in precincts in which this happens every day. The data bears that out. It shows you that there are precincts that have these type of shootings, these type of robberies. I used to always tell people, when you're looking for an apartment in New York City, go to the police center or look online and look at the report, the police report of your precinct. So you can see how many murders, how many robberies, how many shootings have taken place. And then hopefully that will help or may guide you in your decision on picking a place to live. So therefore what happened is we have cultures within inside the police department, depending on where you're working at. And there's no help, there's no mental health for the police officers that day in and day out and do this. I'm also a veteran. I was in the military. In the military, after you served the combat tour, you came back home for a year, 2 years. You may have went out 8 months or a year. In the police department, in certain precincts, you engage with this every single day. Robbery, shooting. When one of the officers in New York City Police, Detective Gunn, when he had got shot in the head and he was in a hospital, you know what they did when police officers came to visit him and he was in a coma. And when their radios was on and it started ringing and it said 1013, his heart started racing. They had to send a memo to the police department to say that when officers come to visit him, make sure that you turn off your radio, because for somehow or another, him hearing it, his heart began to race. So we have cultures, subcultures within the culture of the police department. And then once again, a lot of it is the expectations that we put on the police officers. Like I stated earlier, if you don't tell me that I don't have to write a summons, if you don't tell me that I have to make an arrest, I have a different type of interaction with the community, and I have a totally different culture, as opposed to I have to go out there and I have to do this. And especially when it comes to making arrests and also issuing summonses. So if you pull that back, you won't have that type of culture of, us versus them or warrior, mentality. Is the difference. And then also we look at a lot of people that are on police departments across the country are people who are veterans, who served in the military. And now they come out and they go into police departments. So basically they have already been trained in the warrior mentality. But then now when you come there, if you tell them to go out and make arrests and to go out and make summonses, they go out and do as directed. If you tell them no summonses, no arrests, then they won't do it, because they have certain events in the police department where there's certain parades or whatever, and they tell you there will be no issuing of summonses, there will be no arrests. And what happens during those events? There's no issuing of summonses and there's no arrest. And therefore, what does that do? That lessens the contact time with the public in a negative way. It also helps to reinforce a culture of community-based. This is what we're doing. We're not out there to arrest them. We're not out there to penalize them. It's not us versus them. We're there to help and assist them. But what happens is when you say we have to do this, mandatory summons, mandatory arrest, you cause issues for the police officers. And then you have that correlation of I have to go out and do this. It's us versus them. I have to meet my numbers. And you make it, and what you're doing is you're creating a culture of hunters. And in a very harsh word, hunters, you must go out and do this. And so,
Dr. Odom.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. I think that our discussion today about police culture, about administrative behavior, about action is really helpful. We had one other question on our group chat that deals with this defunding conversation. And so I just wanted to allow some time for that person to ask the question, but thank you very much for your comments. But stand ready because this question is coming. Tom, did you want to ask your question now?
Thank you very much. There's a little background noise and I apologize. One of the ways at the federal level that we have changed behavior, and in particular in the area of credit programs where I work a lot, is by passing new budget rules. So I was wondering whether a budget rule that said that any settlement of a local government for police violence would come out of the police budget and not out of general funds would have a positive effect, because if there's a settlement for police violence, 8 officers have to be let go. And you'd build a feedback loop in so that your union wasn't always defending the lowest common denominator, because they'd be looking at the larger whole. Now, I raised this idea with a friend, and he said, yeah, it might work, but it's not politically feasible. So I'm interested, A, is it a useful idea, particularly today when everybody's really attuned to issues of police violence, and B, is it politically feasible?
Thank you. Is that action considered qualified immunity, or does it align with qualified immunity, Tom?
Well, qualified immunity has to do with the individual officer. I'm trying to get at the issue of the unions, and it's true of any trade association, any large body. They tend to protect their lowest common denominator because that's how you build a big organization. So I'm trying to figure out a way to create a different set of incentives so that they'll care about the whole rather than particular officers, as somebody said, that might have 17 complaints against them.
Thank you, Tom. And then Professor Myers has his hand raised. Did you want to weigh into this line of discussion, Professor Myers?
So I'm in Minnesota, and there's a lot of talk. I think that the City Council unanimously voted and a veto proof initiative to, in effect, defund the police department. But as a prelude to that, the first African American president of the Undergraduate Student Association sent a letter to the brand new president of the University of Minnesota, our first female president, and that letter demanded that the University of Minnesota sever its relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department. And within 24 hours, the University of Minnesota severed its relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department. And I want to tell you, I teach a policy analysis class. And as soon as I saw the letter demanding that we eliminate, sever our relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, I said, this is going to be the case study that I'm going to include in my policy analysis class. Because there are a lot of remedies, a lot of solutions that have been put forward very quickly by people who are activists, people who are deeply concerned about problems. But I remember when the first step in the eightfold path to problem solving is to find the problem. And so here you have the University of Minnesota, in effect, defunding the Minneapolis Police Department. Here you have the City Council defunding the police department. And my first question is, well, wait a minute. Is the problem the funding for the police department? Or is the problem the police department? Does defunding the police department in any way change the use of violence, the disproportionate stops, and so forth? Now, by the way, this is a nice, safe place to have a conversation. This is not the kind of thing that I would say to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times and so forth, because I don't want people to misunderstand. So I'm not an opponent to reforming the police department, but I am an opponent to putting the solution before the problem. So here's a particular thing that we have analyzed in our Executive Leadership Institute that we run for the National Forum for Blacks in Public Administration. Okay, so for the past 14 years, we've been doing this workshop a 1-week workshop, on problem structuring and policy analysis. And one of the examples had to do with liability insurance for police departments, for police officers, where the insurance is paid for by the individual police officer and not by the police department. Now, this is just economics, okay? This is just the issue of who should bear the costs associated with mistakes, okay? And the dilemma is that if you can't get insurance, you can't get hired. If you engage in misbehavior, you'll never get insurance. See, it turns out that it's similar to having an orthopedic surgeon having to have insurance. The more people they maim, the higher their premiums will be, and the lower the likelihood that they'll be able to work as an orthopedic surgeon. And so malpractice insurance actually has part of that corrective device. Okay, so who pays the malpractice insurance? The American Medical Association gets upset when they say that malpractice insurance is so high and it's driving people out of the market. But then on the other hand, somebody has to have the appropriate incentive not to misbehave. And so this is analysis that we did in the workshop. And one of the interesting things was that all of the local governments, even the progressive local governments, were opposed. They were opposed to any type of the requirement that police officers be bonded, that to be insured. And so what's so ironic is that in order for my barber to cut my hair, my barber has to have a license. And my barber has to be insured. And the moment that my barber gets an infraction, he loses his license, he can't cut my hair anymore. And so you're telling me that we have bonding insurance requirements for barbers, but we don't have bonding and insurance requirements for police officers. So that's one of the issues that I hope that people will begin to talk about. Now, that's a small issue. I doubt whether or not it's going to have a massive transformative effect. But a lot of these little small issues are the ones that I think we can focus on within the context of good policy analysis.
Thank you very much, Professor Myers. Like you, I do believe in defining the problem. But I think today our discussion was more about really defining what is considered when we talk about defunding. I want to ask you, I want to remind you that we've established a time period for this discussion, and we have a little bit of business to do. Regrettably, our time for discussion has come to an end, but this is just the first of many discussions, and also it's the first of setting the agenda. And so I do want to ask you if you could please thank all of our invited guests today for joining us, for being brave, for creating a space where we discuss these issues and also raise other issues and other challenges. We know that policies, programs, and practices are all under the microscope currently, but executive action is the action that matters. And so I just want to say on behalf of our standing panels, all of our guests, thank you so much for sharing your time and talent with us today, and we promise to keep this conversation going. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Gary, now.
Okay, thanks, Jade. Mm-hmm. Wow, that was such a great conversation. And
that it was.
Jade, I don't know how you can keep it to this time limit. There's so much more to discuss and so much more input that we could learn from our participants. As I was listening, Reverend Pierce's comments on living wage play so much into this discussion, and what we can learn from other impacts from other things beyond policing, on policing. Dr. Odom, you're passionate about the incentives and measurement of police and how that creates culture and produces perverse impacts and also distracts from what police know they really need to do. So it hurts them in doing their job. And just learning about that more was really telling. And Dr. Al-Qadri, I think you got off really well. I mean, if we go back to the appeal police principles of policing, we'd all be better off. And recognizing that as we move forward. I had three, takeaways from this conversation. One is that the defund movement, whatever you hear about it and whatever view you have of whether it means take away money or give more money or whatever, or reallocate money, what it clearly does, it catalyzes this crucial conversation. And we need to spend some more time on it. And so we will be scheduling more of these types of conversations going forward. The second is that the police culture stems from the design of how we design police forces. And it goes back to the comments about the appeal principles, but also gets back to systemic racism, and other things that have been around a long time, and that if we're really going to solve it, we need to look at that design, and we need to involve the police, we need to involve the community. I think several of our speakers made this point, our religious groups and policymakers. And then there's a need for action. We need to get beyond the discussions and experiment and look at, I think Margaret Sims would applaud this, look at measuring results. What are we trying to accomplish and how do we know when we're accomplishing it? And so, again, I want to thank you all for participating. I want to thank our audience for their participation and for hanging in there. In our last 5 minutes, I would like to just point out a couple of things, a couple of resources that are out in the field that we've been working on. One is the transition papers that are online at the NAPA website. So if you go to napawash.org and click on Election 2020, there's a work group that includes myself, Margaret Sims, Jade, and Demetra Nightingale. And there are a couple of good papers on there you might want to take a look at. One is Improving Child Well-Being and Reducing Food Insecurity. And the other is Promoting Social Equity in an Evidence-Based Policy Environment. And what we're really discussing there are some action items that can be taken to really try to get to the root of culture across different program areas. The second thing I'd like to point out is that Terry Garten has been doing a series of podcasts that are also available, Management Matters, whether you get them on Apple or any of the podcast series. There are some really good podcasts on there. And we've also been doing a series on a special edition series specifically related to how do we create a sustainable progress out of the COVID and the other events that have the pandemics that have taken place here in the U.S. Finally, Terry, do you want to mention the letter that's out there for fellow signature? I know not everybody on this call is a fellow, but there is a pending letter which will be released soon, which sets out certain principles that we want to embody within the standing panel, certainly, and hopefully within the rest of NAPA, about how do we try to get at the heart of systemic racism and try to alleviate that. So if fellows, if you have not yet seen that letter, please either contact myself, Terry, Caitlin, or just if you have received the notice, please do pay attention to, and we encourage you to add your name. So with that, Terry, I want to just give you a chance. Is there anything else you want to leave for closing?
I just want to thank everybody for participation today. I mean, we had an amazing turnout. and a really powerful conversation. So Gary, Jay, Margaret, I thank you so much for arranging this, and I want to thank all of the guests who participated in lending their insights to the conversation. And as Gary points out, we are really trying to position the social equity panel to be a leader and a leading voice in this conversation. We look forward to creating the opportunity for more of these conversations. So again, really appreciate it. As I said at the beginning, we did record it, so we'll be looking to pull that together and then have the opportunity to share it more broadly for those who weren't able to join the call this morning. Thank you.
Okay, great. And with that, I think we can adjourn, and we look forward to seeing all of you in the near future. Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay, I think I removed everyone who was lagging behind.